This morning I thought we'd take a trip back into the Old Testament and look at something in the Old Testament, because we've done a few things in the New Testament lately. The Old Testament is a wonderful record of a particular slice of world history. But it is more than just a slice of history, because it is God working in that history and in the lives of mankind. As you read the Old Testament, you come to the book of Kings and the Chronicles, and also different books of the prophets, and you read about what was going on in the world then, when God was standing behind it and pulling the strings, so to speak. The year was 1971 BC, when Solomon became king of the nation of God's people Israel. He rules over them and he strays from God. And in 1931, the king dies, and all of the power that he had amassed for the nation of Israel was suddenly evaporating like snow in the heat of the midday sun. He has Rehoboam, his son, who wasn't ready, wasn't equipped, was not wise enough to be king, and he rejects all of the attempts of the 10 northern tribes to keep the nation unified. And they forsake him and they go back to their homes and they build the nation called Israel, consisting of the 10 northern tribes. These 10 tribes kept hearing from God, who said, "This is my will for you, and this is how I want you to worship, and this is how I want you to do things." And he said, "I'll reward you if you do them, if you're faithful. And if you reject them," he says, "I'll punish you." But Israel continued in its wicked ways. Jeroboam, the first king, leads them down the proverbial garden path. He leads them into pagan idolatry, mostly because he doesn't want them to go back to Jerusalem to worship, and the fear of losing his political influence over them. And so that would have been political suicide for him. And so to retain that kingdom and his kingship, he stops that and he builds altars up to the pagan idols, and he tells the people, "This is where we will worship, and this is who we will worship in our own country." As all of that was going on, God was angered, and in it all all of it came to a crashing halt in 721 BC. Assyria, the rising empire from the east, came their way and swallowed up Israel, sent thousands of Jews back to Assyria to be resettled, and sent thousands of Assyrians into what was formerly Israel to be settled there. And that pretty much broke the back of any rebellion ever rising up again. Meanwhile, down south in the kingdom of Judah and Benjamin that were joined together, they formed the kingdom of Judah. It wasn't a big nation by nation standards in any way, but they were more faithful to God than Jeroboam and the northern kingdom were. They continued to listen to God, well, at least to a point, better than Israel was doing, although they weren't totally faithful either. And so their time also came when they were facing destruction. It was looming ever more so from the east for them, and Hezekiah the king is listening to God and trying to do his best, I suppose, in listening to God, but the inevitable was about to happen. Judah, in another 100 years, were going to be taken over by the kingdom of Babylon. So they go about another 100 years. And it's at this time that a great adventure story takes place that I want to share with you this morning. When you read the scripture, you have to use your imagination a little sometimes to put yourself in the place of the people and the writer who's writing the story or the account. How completely exciting it would have been, and at the same time, how completely terrifying it would have been. It's a story that will live throughout all the days of this earth. The Assyrian army had come over from the east, and they're standing outside the gates of Jerusalem, 2 Kings chapter 18 through 20. The reason they were there was because Hezekiah, as king of Israel, had had a good time. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he ruled for 29 years. And things went well for him. And so the day came when Hezekiah was feeling pretty good about himself, and he said, I'm no longer going to pay tribute to the king of Assyria, because that's what he had been doing. I will not pay the taxes. I won't let them rob Israel's finances from them anymore. I am king, will be independent of Assyria. We want our freedom, our independence. Now Isaiah the prophet said, don't you do that, Hezekiah. The Lord doesn't want you to do that. But like many people do, he thought he knew better. And that's what he wanted to do. And so he went ahead and he pulled away from Assyria. Well, the good times were over. Hezekiah had taken away the idols, and he had destroyed the high places in Jerusalem and tried to restore the laws of God, and he tried to get the people to do what God wanted them to do for so many years. And it came to this point in his life, and he said, I think I have it now. I think I know what I want to do, and I think I know what God wants me to do. And so he cuts loose from the will of God, and he says, I'm going to go it alone. I'll launch out there on my own because I can do it now. I've got myself in that position. Well, when that happened, Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, comes over to Jerusalem. And as they come on their way, the armies surround smaller little towns and little kingdoms and take over those kingdoms as they're coming. And so in the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign, they're standing at the gates of Jerusalem. And there's a crisis for King Hezekiah, and he has to face it. It's the first one in his kingship he has to face. I'm surprised, and maybe it's because God is the victor in all of this, but this would be one of the greatest movies that Hollywood has never made. It is something that you and I need to really understand and take to heart. There's a lesson here for us to hang on to. While they were outside the gates, Hezekiah repented of what he had done. He sent a message to Sennacherib, and he says, I've done wrong. I shouldn't have done this. I should have paid you tribute, like the mob gets people to pay them tribute. And so he strips all the gold off of the temple of God, and he sends it to Sennacherib. But this time Sennacherib, he didn't listen, and instead he just kept coming. He took the gold. He said, thank you very much, but I'm going to do you in anyways. I'm going to show you. I'm going to take Jerusalem. When he got outside the city, that is where the confrontation is going to take place. And Rabshakeh was Sennacherib's general and chief of the army. And he came up to the walls of Jerusalem, and he calls out to the sentries, to the watchmen that were on the walls. The watchmen there are trapped in that city, just like the rest of them. They can't go anywhere, and there's a siege now laid before the city, and so in time they're going to run out of food and good drinking water and all of these things. And so they're going to be starved out of their city. And he speaks, and he actually yells loudly so that they can all hear him. But Hezekiah told the people, he said, listen to him, but don't say a word. Don't say anything to him. And so he says, he comes and he says, what in the world are you guys thinking? What are you doing? And he begins in Aramaic, and then he switches over to Hebrew. And everyone understood what he was saying. And the people of Hezekiah's representatives that went out to him, they said, hey, whoa. Speak in Aramaic. We understand it. Don't speak in Hebrew because it'll make all of those people afraid. And he says, what do you mean? He says, their lives are at stake here too. They're going to die like the rest of you are, so let them hear me. You're surrounded. You're cut off from everything. And he says, in whom do you now trust that you have rebelled against me? You think you can trust in the words of your king Hezekiah? Those are just words. There's no battle strategy there. There's no power for war there. Those are just words. And then he says, oh, or are you trusting in Egypt? Well, they kind of were, because Hezekiah had sent money down to the Egyptians, and he said, I want you guys to come and fight by our side. And so they were kind of trusting in Egypt. But you see, Egypt had been a pawn in those days of a lot of international intrigues. And so Israel found out, like the rest did, that Egypt was really unreliable. They weren't trustworthy. He said, they sent him money, and they took the money, and they didn't come up to help them. And then he says, oh, so you can't trust in them. And then he says, are you trusting in the Lord your God? Have you noticed all of the nations that we have conquered on our way to Jerusalem? And none of their gods could save them. So what's so special about your God? And in fact, he says, your king, he's kicked all the gods out of Jerusalem. So he's thinking, he's got the gods upset at him. You see, he drove out your own gods. But Rabshakeh didn't understand. He was very ignorant as to what was going on in Jerusalem, because he didn't make a difference between Jehovah God and all of the idol gods. He didn't understand any difference there. And so he says, there is nothing under the sun that can save you from us. And if you think you're going to be a military power, or you have military power, he said, that's just a joke. You're a joke. It's kind of like the Canadian military. But he said, if I gave you 2,000 horses, could you even find 2,000 riders in all of Jerusalem for those horses? The answer was no, they couldn't. You don't have anything to fight with. You can't match the might that you see outside these walls of yours. The truth is, and he didn't realize it at the time, was they didn't have the might to face the one that was fighting from inside the walls of Jerusalem. And so they're out there, and they're marching around, and they're setting up their tents, and they're camping the city, and they're getting ready for war, and they have to get inside those walls. And you kind of get the feeling that the Jews were experiencing. If you put yourself in their position, this massive army out there, and they've pinned you inside these walls, and pretty soon you're going to run out of water and food, and you can't see any possible way out. Your situation is hopeless. You are defeated, and you will not make it out alive. Well, look at what happened. Hezekiah, hearing and seeing all of this, he goes to God, Jehovah, and he gets his answer. Here's what he does. He sends to Isaiah the prophet, and he prays to God, and he says, God, have you heard what these guys are saying about you? These awful things that Rabshakeh is saying about you? Hear me, O God, incline your ear to me and listen to me. He's insulted you. Please hear me and help us. And Isaiah sends an answer back saying, God has answered your prayer, and he says, Sennacherib will not win. You will not fall. He will hear a rumor, and he's going to return to his home, and he's going to die there. Now that didn't look very promising from a physical perspective at that point. But time passes, they're still under siege, and you notice with God, nothing happens usually doesn't happen just that quick. You got to have a little patience. He works all things out, right? And so time passed, and Rabshakeh had returned home for something, and he comes back, and the siege is still on, and so he writes a letter this time, and he sends this letter to King Hezekiah, and he basically says the same things. He says, you're doomed, you're not going anywhere, you can't be saved, no one's going to save you, don't count on your God, because he isn't even there. In fact, guess what? He said, it's your God that sent me here to take care of you. Well, I guess when you're an emissary with political propaganda, there's an unwritten rule somewhere that says you don't have to tell the truth or know the truth or anything like that. And so you can just make it as ugly as you want or as rosy as you want. And that's kind of what he does. And so Hezekiah got that letter, and he took it, and he went to the temple, and he laid it out there before God. And he says, look, God, look what they're saying about you. They're saying you can't save us. They're saying they have thrown all these other people's gods into the fire and burned them, and that's what they're going to do with you. And then he says, so God, save us, so that they will know that you are the only true and living God. You need to do this to uphold your name. And Isaiah the prophet sends back the answer. God says he will not enter that city of mine. He won't shoot an arrow at that city. He said he will not lay siege with a ladder. He will not put dirt mounds up or build dirt ramps up the wall to get into the city, because those were all the common ways that they conquered a city in those days. And he said he'll hear a rumor and he'll go back to his home and he'll die there. Well, what happened back there? The Bible gives us so much detail about some things, and then there are some things that you really want to know exactly what happened. Tell me every detail, and it gives you almost nothing. But it does say this. It doesn't say how it all happened, but it says 185,000 Assyrian soldiers died that night. It doesn't say how they died. It just says the next morning they got up and there was these bodies laying everywhere, dead. Imagine standing on that wall after hearing all the boasting and seeing all of those corpses that littered the ground. Imagine how impressed God's people were when they saw what God did for them. That huge army overnight ceased to exist. It was no more. It was dead. It was gone. But those people that were inside the walls of Jerusalem, they knew. They knew what happened. Even if Sennacherib couldn't figure it out, they knew what happened. But I want you to capture that feeling. I want you to really get the experience they had. And I don't know, I can put it in all kinds of words. But I want to share it with you from a poem that I found. Lord Byron, he's an English guy, but you can tell by the name, Lord Byron, wrote a poem talking about the destruction of Sennacherib. It's a beautiful poem. It not only captures what happened, but it also captures the emotion of the moment. So I want to share it with you. The Assyrians came down like a wolf on the fold. His cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold. The sheen on their spears were like stars on the sea when the blue waves rolled nightly on the deep Galilee. Like the leaves of the forest when summer is green, the hosts with their banners at sunset were seen. Like the leaves of the forest when autumn has blown, that post on the morrow laid withered and strown. For the angel of death spread his wings on the blast, and breathed in the face of the foe as he passed. And the eyes of the sleepers waxed deadly and chill, and their hearts but once heaved and forever grew still. And there lay the steed with his nostrils all wide, but through it there rolled not the breath of his pride. And the foam of his gasping lay white on the turf, and the cold as the spray of the rock-beating surf. And there lay the rider, distorted and pale, with the dew on his brow and the rust on his mail. And the tents were all silent, the banners alone, the lances uplifted, the trumpet unblown. And the widows of Asher are loud in their wail, and the idols are broke in the temple of Baal. And the might of the Gentile, unsmoked by the sword, hath melted like snow in the glance of the Lord. That's how Lord Byron saw it. That's the picture he had of it. But whatever it was, it had to be dramatic. It had to be amazing to be a Jew and to know that is what our God did for us. But that was then. This is now. What has this adventurous story of fear and terror and deliverance and relief have to do with us today? Well, I think it teaches us a key part of being a child of God. It teaches us where we ought to be trusting. You see, you and I don't always face an army of thousands, of 185,000. But let me say this, we do face everything today that brings that same kind of fear and terror if we're not grounded in Christ. You see, this fear may take on many different forms. It may be that you lost your job or you lost something that gave you a sense of worth, and suddenly that's all gone. And it weighs just like an army that is fighting against you. It may be someone out there that is putting God down, just like Rabshakeh did. And you're going, oh. Instead, look to God. Say, hey, God, do you hear what they're saying about you? He's going to deal with them too, just like he did with the Assyrians. It may be that you've had wealth and you are leaning on your wealth, and all of a sudden that money installation you had is gone. You don't have it anymore. And that's when you really find out where you're putting your trust. It could be that your friends, they brought you a lot of comfort. And then all of a sudden you look around and your friends aren't there anymore and you're left alone because you take a stand for God or something like that. Everywhere you look in life, you may see success or failure, and you discover after a while that none of it is permanent. In fact, that it's all temporary. And last of all, you'll find yourself coming face to face with death, and you cannot think of anything to fight it with, and you can't do anything about it. Well, I suppose if you're in that situation, in any of those situations, that you could gather some of your friends around you to comfort you. But it might turn out like Job did with his friends, and they all turned on him. Or, like some do, they try to use their wealth to purchase a cure or a healing or a this or a that, to find a solution, to insulate them from health risks or mistreatment. But that usually fails in the end. But feeling what those people felt, trapped inside the city walls of Jerusalem, you realize that, like Hezekiah, there are only two things that are going to get you through. There are only two things that are going to help you to make it and to deliver you. One of them is prayer. And the other one is God. Prayer and God. And that'll get you through anything. Hezekiah laid it out there before God, and he said, God, I need your help. We need you. You need to get us through this. I don't have the strength. I don't have the army. I don't have anything. But you have it. And I need you to do it for us. And I know that that thing outside the walls is no match for you. And this thing I'm dealing with today is no match for you. And God said, I've heard you. I know what my enemies are saying about me. I hear them. I know who he is. I know who they are. And I'm telling you that their mouths are going to be shut. And that their boasting is going to come to naught. I'll take care of it. Sennacherib, by the way, he went home, humiliated. He went to his idol, his God, in his little prayer house. And as he knelt down before his idol, his two sons took the sword and cut his head off. He died by the hand of his two sons. God is powerful, and we have access to that power. We can tap into the power of God with prayer. And when things look the most hopeless and awful, and there's nothing that we can do or anyone else can do, prayer opens the doors and the gates of God's blessings. If you have trouble, and I can tell you, if you have breath in your lungs, if you are alive, you're going to have trouble in this world. I hope you find yourself right where Hezekiah was, on your knees before God, praying and realizing that He's the only one that can help you deal with your situation successfully. And that's enough. That's all you need. So in whom do you trust? If you're a child of God, then remember to pray and to let God take care of business. And if you're not a child of God, if you've not made that choice, this morning would be a wonderful time to make that choice, because then you have insulation against the rigors of life and the trials of life that are too much for any of us to handle all on our own. So you can tap into the prayer and the power of God. And I pray that you reach out and take God's hand right now while we stand and sing.
Walk with the Lord in the light of His word. What glory He sheds on our way. While we do His good will, He abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. Not a shadow can rise, not a cloud in the skies, but His smile quickly drives it away. Not a doubt nor a fear, not a sigh nor a tear can abide while we trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. Not a burden we bear, not a sorrow we share, but our toil He doth richly repay. Not a grief nor a loss, not a frown nor a cross, but is blessed if we trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. But we never can prove the delights of His love until all on the altar we lay. For the favor He shows and the joy He bestows are for those who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. And then in fellowship sweet we will sit at His feet, or we'll walk by His side in the way. What He says we will do, where He sends we will go. Never fear, only trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and